Hello everyone. It's time to begin chapter 5, our chapter on sense, sensation, perception. I personally find this to be an interesting chapter, though I don't think I did so much as an undergraduate. In this chapter, you'll learn how your various senses work. Most of us, myself included, probably don't think much about them as long as they're functioning properly. But if you're born with an issue, or you acquire an issue, or maybe just through either accident or aging, you might spend a lot of focus on the functioning of your senses. So let's learn how the senses work, how the process of sensation works, and how it all comes together in the process of perception. So let's start. Now that we've finished our vision sense, let's consider our next sense, the auditory sense. It can also be called our sense of audition. What do we hear? Well, we hear sound waves. So the outer ear acts as a funnel and funnels sound waves. We hear better than species that lack an outer ear. And you might wonder, well, what species lack an outer ear? Well, think for a moment and see if you can come up with one or two. Perhaps you thought of birds, or perhaps reptiles. They lack outer ears. We hear better because of our funneling device. Don't you instinctively, when you can't hear somebody talk, put your hand up by your ear to cup it to functionally make a larger outer ear? The sound wave will then travel down a long canal called the auditory canal. Little auditory canal trivia for you. What is the most common non-native, and I'll say it again, not a native thing that must be removed from auditory canals by doctors? If you're thinking earwax, no, that's native to the ear. Keep thinking. If you're thinking insect, yes. Which particular one? It might surprise you to know the cockroach. So hopefully as the sound wave passes down your auditory canal, it is passing nary a cockroach. The sound wave will then travel to the end of the canal and strike the eardrum, putting into motion. This is important because the energy has now transformed itself from sound waves to mechanical vibration. This mechanical vibration will be passed to the structures that connect to the eardrum. So first the vibration would pass to a tiny bone called the hammer, next to a tiny bone called the anvil, next to a tiny bone called the stirrup. Their names are a reference in Latin to what they look like to the ancient Romans, who apparently were looking at the ear structures. There's a nice mnemonic, HAS does form a word. These tiny bones are called the ossicles, but we really don't need to know that term. They are the tiniest bones of the human body. Now, the stirrup rests against a strangely shaped structure, and if you take a look at it, maybe you can see that it looks a little snail-like. Well, the ancient root of the word cochlea does refer to snail. Now, inside the cochlea, we have fluid, and we also have neurons for hearing. They're not rods, they're not cones. They are called hair cells because they have a tiny hair-like projection that sticks out of them. Think of maybe a pipe cleaner, if you know what that looks like, crumpled up accordion style, and you'll have a pretty good representation of the hair on the hair cell. So when the vibration travels through the bones and strikes the cochlea, it'll cause the fluid inside to slosh around. That stimulates the hairs on the hair cells. And since hair cells are neurons, when you stimulate neurons, all neurons behave the same. They have action potentials. So this action potential will now leave the ear through a nerve. Would you care to guess its name? If you're thinking auditory nerve, good guess, you are correct. It would then go to the sensory relay center of the brain. Was that thalamus or hypothalamus? Hopefully you thought thalamus. It will then relay it to the appropriate lobe of the cerebral cortex for hearing. Which would be the hearing lobe? It had a nice mnemonic, remember? You hear tempos and oral things, so it's the temporal lobe by the ears. And if all goes well, you will hear, and you will hear well. Maybe you noticed that we didn't mention the eustachian tube. I skip it until the end because it just interferes with the flow of the conversation. So the eustachian tube is a tube that goes to the throat, and it's there to equalize pressure. We really only notice it when it doesn't work well. For example, if you're in a plane going up steeply up into the atmosphere, or maybe just driving up a car on a mountain road, or maybe you have a cold or allergies and you're swollen and that tube swells shut, and then you feel that terrible pressure. Well, hopefully an allergy pill or a cold pill will help to dilate that tube and the pressure goes away. You might also notice that we skipped the semicircular canals. We did that because they're not related to the sense of audition. They'll be related to a sense that we'll talk about later on in this chapter. On the next slide, see if you can go ahead and study these parts, and then on the next slide, see if you can fill them in. So please study the ear diagram on the previous page, and when you write the test yourself, go ahead and see how you do. So let's see how you did. A would be the pinna, the outer ear. Either term is fine. B, that would be the auditory canal. C, the eardrum, though if you know the term tympanic membrane, great, but eardrum is fine. D would be the ear bones, though if you were particularly fancy, you said ossicles, but we don't need the term ossicles. E would be the hammer. F would be the anvil. G would be the stirrup. H would be the tube, but what's the complete name? Eustachian tube. J, pointing to the snail structure, which is called the cochlea. We didn't mention I, though if you snuck a peek, semicircular canals. We'll talk about them later on in the course. If you had any trouble, go ahead and study a little bit more and test yourself again. Let's now consider the three types of deafness: conduction, nerve, and central. In conduction deafness, the parts of the ear that are supposed to vibrate and hence conduct vibrations are not functioning properly. Take a moment and think of what parts are supposed to vibrate. Well, first it would be the eardrum, and after the eardrum, the three tiny bones, formerly known as the ossicles, but it's perfectly fine to call them the three tiny bones. This can often be partially remedied by a standard hearing aid, but there are many issues with hearing aids. They distort background noise. Your medical plans typically pay nothing towards them, and difficulties in use and so on. How does one acquire conduction deafness? Well, it can be either long-time use, such as a lifetime of hearing, or even relatively short-term abuse, such as a concert or even bar scene with very loud music. When you're doing loud things, use ear protection, whether it's mowing lawn, leaf blowing, what have you. Preserve your hearing. Now let's consider nerve deafness. What are the two nerve parts involved in hearing? Take a moment and consider that. Well, it's the neurons involved in hearing, the hair cells, and the auditory nerve. How can you acquire damage to these? Much in the same way as conduction deafness, either a lifetime abuse or fairly short-term abuse, although there are a few drugs in the market that do cause nerve damage. They're for very obviously serious conditions. Let's last consider central deafness. Now, we introduced the term central back in the biology chapter, chapter 3. Do you remember the context? Central nervous system. You might remember the two parts of the central nervous system are the brain and spinal cord. So in central deafness, the person has suffered brain damage. And what are the two brain parts involved in hearing? Think for a moment. Well, the sensory relay center. And let's see, was that the thalamus or the hypothalamus? Hopefully you went with thalamus. And the lobes for hearing, they would be by your ears, and for hearing, oral or tempos, so the temporal lobes. Next, please click on both these two websites. I think you'll like them very much. They're short and they are very touching, and you'll be able to see easily what type of deafness was being treated. So we've considered the sense of vision, we've considered the auditory sense. Now let's consider two more senses, often referred to as the chemical senses, because we're either smelling bits of chemical in the air or tasting bits of chemical on our tongue. The fancy terms would be olfaction or olfactory, our fancy term for smell, and gustation or gustatory, our fancy term for taste. As a mnemonic, I ask my students to look at the word olfactory very quickly and think, how could that be possibly misread? So do it a couple times and see what you might misread it as. Did you perhaps perceive it as olfactory? If you did, great. If not, still use it that way. Consider it as a mnemonic, a smelly old factory. Maybe they make kimchi or fertilizer, but picture a very smelly old factory. And if you do that, you'll never say that gustatory is a sense of smell because you'll use your mnemonic, olfactory, sense of smell. Receptor cell locations, that would be in the olfactory bulb that you'll see in a picture on the next slide. And it works rather like a lock and key, hence the picture. The molecule will float up there and try to find, just as the lock and key, a receptor site that it fits. It'll try this and that and this and that. And finally, when it fits the receptor site of a particular neuron, that particular neuron will get stimulated and fire. The information will be sent through the brain. You might think and say, I know this, it goes to the thalamus. No, not actually. This is the only sense that totally skips the thalamus. It goes directly into, we learned, the frontal lobe. This is, I think, unfortunate, and it makes it an easy, at least comparably to other senses, an easier to lose sense. I ask my students every year, does anybody know anybody that's lost their sense of smell? And often I'll get 1, 2, 3, or 4 students a semester that know somebody, usually in a car accident or other head trauma. If the brain goes slamming forward, it can interrupt this connection, and the person will lose their sense of smell. And it might not surprise you to know they typically lose their sense of taste as well. I share a little bit of a story about a former office mate who had brain surgery and had his eye removed, and apparently in the process, the olfactory bulb and the connection was damaged. He lost his sense of smell and also his sense of taste. Well, almost entirely. He did still have, unfortunately, the taste of salt. And I had to ask him once, Bob, why do you Bob, why do you eat so much if you can't taste? Because he was an overweight man and he had blood pressure issues. He said, well, I'm never satisfied. And that made a lot of sense to me. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, he could taste salt, and so he used a lot of salt. Again, not good for a person with high blood pressure and weight issues. As you can see, this slide has 2 different perspectives on the olfactory system. On the left, the person is inhaling the scent. In other words, the bits of chemicals of the rose. The molecules are going up into the navel's cavity. And as you see in the other picture, they will interact with the olfactory bulb, which looks rather like a funky toothbrush. Again, it will be a lock and key sort of setup in which that molecule of rose will try to find a corresponding receptor site on a neuron that it fits. Once it fits that receptor site, the neuron fires. Information is sent directly to the brain, to the frontal lobe for processing, skipping the thalamus altogether. The picture on the left includes the limbic system because the sense of smell is particularly strongly linked to emotions. Parts of our limbic systems are the emotion systems, so a smell might bring you back to the emotions of a particular event, maybe of childhood. Maybe you smell lilacs and you remember your grandmother's house, for example. So often smells do bring back emotions. Most of us are very aware of certain losses of sensations, such as vision changes with aging or hearing changes, but most of us don't realize that the loss of smell is fairly common. As you can see from the slide, more than half of the old, which means the 85 plus age group, have no sense of smell whatsoever. And of course, with that goes the sense of taste. Can you think of any implications in terms of why are the elderly that way, or how it could have implications in terms of their lives? Think for a moment and think of these implications of loss of smell and loss of taste. Some of these implications are not necessarily polite. You might have noticed that an older person has a very strong smell. Probably when they take their clothes off, they take a look at it for stains, don't see any, which may often be there because of their lack of the visual acuity. They might smells fine to them, so they repeat the process over and over until they become maybe a little bit pungent. Or perhaps you have an older person in your family that uses too much cologne or too much perfume. Again, they're unable to pick up that particular nuance. They might not be able to tell if the gas of their stove is on, or maybe the garbage can of their house is making odor. What about if they can't taste? Well, they may buy poor quality food. Why bother to get expensive cuts of this or that if you can't taste it? Perhaps why bother to go out and have lunch with friends to a fancy restaurant if you can't taste the food? So, or if they're cooking, they might, as in my example with my friend with the loss of sense of smell, might use perhaps way too much spice or way too much salt on their foods. So loss of smell and taste can affect an older person in many ways, and occasionally younger people who have lost the sense of smell through accidents or other issues. You've probably heard some information about how COVID affects our ability to smell and taste. Loss of smell is a very reliable and very early sign of COVID infection. If you do detect a loss of smell or extremely altered sense of taste, such as things tasting maybe sweet or bitter or salty, but nothing else to the taste experience, treat the same as you would any other possible sign of COVID. Are there any applications of this? Yes, it would be a very reasonable step before you leave the house every day or you have some guests enter your house to do a smell test. Smell some uncooked coffee, a little vanilla extract. If you cannot smell it, consider it to be a very clear and possible sign of COVID exposure. Why does this occur? Well, thank goodness, it's usually not due to neuron damage, but rather it's a result of the support cells, the epithelial cells of that region being under attack. How common is this? Well, in clinical testing, virtually 100% of people will have some degree of smell loss, but at a level that is meaningful, at a level that people can actually recognize it, about 40%. But a full 20% of people have full anosmia, meaning no ability to smell whatsoever. Prognosis, both good and bad news. 50 to maybe 75% of people will fully recover within 1 month. That's the good news. You might ask about the remaining percent. It appears that 25% have not recovered at 6 months or longer. It's not clear at this point whether they will ever fully recover or not. Next, please go to the links below to learn interesting and additional information. Let's now consider the other chemical sense, the gustatory sense, also known as the sense of gustation. How many basic tastes are there? Almost anybody you might ask would say 4, but they would be incorrect. Don't forget umami, which is from the Japanese word for yummy or savory. So if you have like a meaty stew and it's tasty, that savory, meaty flavor, that's the 5th basic sense, umami. It was discovered fairly recently, back in 2007. Next, let's consider the pictures on the bottom of the page, starting with the butterfly. Do you have any idea why there would be a butterfly on this particular slide? It's more than decorative. Interestingly, butterflies taste with their feet. Would be an unattractive prospect for people walking in what we must walk in, but for a butterfly that can drop from flower to flower to flower, apparently it's a very effective arrangement. Let's consider the picture of the coffee and Brussels sprouts. Are you a super taster? Super tasters have nearly 6 times as many taste buds as the rest of us, so they're more likely to register spicy foods as being painful and find both coffee and Brussels sprouts very bitter. So if those 3 statements describe you, you probably are a super taster. So far we've discussed the sensory neurons for the sense of vision, the rods and cones. We've discussed a sensory neuron for hearing, or in other words audition, the hair cells. Let's consider for the sense of taste, in other words the gustatory sense. You might think the bumps on your tongue are your taste buds. Not quite. The bumps are the papillae. The papillae contain the taste buds, and they contain the individual cells for the sense of taste. But you not only have these bumps, these papillae for taste on your tongue, you also have a considerable number on the top of your mouth and even the back of your throat. So perhaps you've noticed when you put your tongue onto the top of your mouth, you feel little bumps. You might be feeling the papillae. Here's 2 bits of trivia regarding taste buds. First, regarding denture wearers. Apparently, denture wearers often find dentures to be hot. Interesting. But another common complaint is that denture wearers often report foods are less flavorful since they've gotten their dentures. This would make sense knowing what we know. If a denture wearer is putting on the top denture on, they're covering up many of the taste buds that taste papilla on the roof of the mouth. Hence, there are less receptor cells to detect flavors, so foods would indeed taste less flavorful. A different piece of trivia, how often are these taste buds replaced? About once every 2 weeks, surprisingly. Hi guys, now let's consider the skin, also called somatic, also called body senses. Location, the skin. Now if you consider the skin, it's our largest and heaviest sensory organ. I don't know if you've seen the shows in which they do skin removal for people who have lost tremendous amounts of weight, but very commonly in surgery they'll take off 10, 20 or more pounds in one surgery, and that is just a fraction of the skin possessed by any individual. So again, the skin is our largest and heaviest sensory organ. There are 3 skin senses. Take a moment and see if you can, without peeking at the slide, figure out what they might be. We also did mention them back when we were talking about the parietal lobe in chapter 3. So did you decide on touch and temperature and pain? If so, very good. Let's consider this diagram. I like it because it's on the simplistic side, and that's why I specifically chose it. Let's start at the upper left with the pain receptor. You'll see that image there that's showing what's called a free nerve ending. Now, free nerve endings aren't just for pain, but they also play a role in touch and temperature as well. In general, pain can be related to damage, particularly to free nerve endings. Pain can either be related to the inflammatory process when cells are damaged, or some pain is related to damaged nerve cells. Nerve pain is particularly problematic. Sometimes people will turn to TENS units to help with chronic pain. There is some new research being done and new treatments being done with TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, we mentioned back in chapter 3. But in general, pain is there to let us know that we've been damaged so we can stop damaging ourselves and attend to the damage. A few people are born without the ability to feel pain. They often accumulate great injury, biting their tongues, the side of their mouth. Consider as you sit in the chair, you're constantly shuffling to reduce pain. We roll around and flop around all night long to reduce pain and pressure points. People without pain do none of these things. They often accumulate great damage. They're also not aware of typically infections, injuries, and they often die much, much, much younger in life than the rest of us. So pain, although not a pleasant thing, is a very necessary thing. If you go to the image below that, you'll see cold receptor, and on the opposite side, heat receptor. So you can call them cold and heat, or cold and hot. These are also related to free nerve ending functioning. It's interestingly, and I'll throw some numbers at you right now that you do not need to know, but cold receptors respond to temperatures between 50 and 68. Hot temperatures respond to temperatures between 77 and 113. If you didn't catch those numbers, fine, but I would like you to know that in the middle range between 69 and 76, what most of us would call room temperature, then there are no nerve endings that respond directly to those temperatures. So sitting in the same room of 68 or 72, one person might be hot, one person might be cold, in no small part because we don't have equipment in our bodies that respond directly to those particular temperatures. Kind of interesting, I think. You can see that we have touch receptors and pressure receptors. So if I ask you the 3 skin or somatic and body senses and you say touch, temperature, and pain, or if you say pressure, temperature, and pain, I would accept touch or pressure quite interchangeably. We do have cells, not shown on this particular slide, but shown in your book, that respond to light touch. These, which you do not need to know for me, the Merkel disc and the Meissner corpuscles. There's also some degree of vibration detection ability. There's also for deeper pain, deeper touch, That would be the Pacini corpuscles. More detail than we need to know. Just walk away knowing that we have receptors that respond to light touch, receptors that respond to heavier touch or pressure. We have receptors for hot and cold, and we have pain receptors. It's interesting that I want to stop right there and do a pause, just so in case I make a slip, I don't have to record the entire spiel again for you. Before we leave the slide, one interesting point. We know that we have the shared nerve endings, the free nerve endings that can pick up both touch and temperature and pain. They work rather like a party line. I don't know if you've had any experience with a party line, probably not, but as a child growing up and visiting my grandparents, lived in a farm in the countryside, they had a party line. Many phones used the same line, so when a phone rang, you had a particular ring for your phone, and anybody could pick up and listen to you on your conversation. So it was a shared line. And our free nerve endings rather work like that. So for example, if you ever got, say, punched as a child or injured yourself, a natural reaction would be to rub the injury, because when you're injured, all that pain information is going to the brain. But if you rub it, now it's a party line, so that same wiring is sending both pain and touch, which means less pain information gets through. For the same reason we might put hot or cold on injury, not only to influence swelling, but also to detract from the pain information, since it's now competing with hot or cold. So again, how do these influence each other? Rather like a party line with shared wiring. Numerous studies have looked at post-op people listening to music versus control group not listening to music. Perhaps not a surprise to you since you're looking at this overhead. The experimental group people listening to music actually required significantly less pain medication. So this is not only useful for people in hospitals, it could be useful to you and I. Is this image some sort of grotesque joke? No, it's actually quite scientific. It's a homunculus. If you consider the amount of cortex in your brain devoted to touch and temperature and pain, what lobe would that be in? So review: temporal, frontal, parietal, occipital. Hopefully you went for parietal. Anyway, if you consider the amount of territory in your parietal lobe devoted to your skin senses, you would think that large structures would have a vast amount of cerebral cortex space, whereas very small structures would have far less space in the brain devoted to them. Nothing could be farther than the truth. Basically, brain footage depends on importance. So the lip and the tongue in a speaking oral species such as ourselves gets a tremendous amount of brain space. And our hands, so important for our daily living, again, though not particularly large, get a tremendous amount of space in your parietal lobe. Bigger structures, say your chest or your arms, your legs, get much less brain territory. So that is your homunculus and shows you how your space is distributed in your parietal lobe for touch and temperature and pain. Let's test ourselves to see if we're comfortable with the concepts of sense, sensation, perception. For each one of these, identify which of the three concepts the question represents. And if there's a blank, go ahead and fill in the blanks as well. In orange, we'll start with senses. And hopefully you notice that all those 3, 9, 21, and 33 represent the correct possible answer if you're given the query of the number of senses. And you'll know that 5 isn't there. It would only be there if the phrase classic or classical was used. Next, you smell something, but it's not determined what the something is. That would be a sensation. The brain has it, but has not done any processing really. In terms of the blanks, you have to remember the 3 basic types of neurons: interneurons, motor neurons, and sensory neurons. Hopefully you will go with sensory. And what was that bulb for smell? Not a light bulb, but an olfactory bulb. And what was the lobe involved for smell and taste for that matter? Hopefully you'll remember the four lobes, frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital, and hopefully you went with frontal. Next in green, it's the sound, and that sound has been interpreted, it's been identified, it's been fully processed. Well, that's perception. In blue, rods and cones are a structural part of a sense, so it would be sense. The specific taste of an ice cream, pistachio in this example, that would be fully processed, it'd be interpreted, that would be perception. And the skin senses, body senses, somatic senses, indeed, that would be, again, senses. Hopefully you did well. If not, study a little bit more and perhaps redo the slide. Let's finish our discussion of the senses. I call this grouping the forgotten senses. That's not a formal term, but I just find it useful. If you were one of the people that said we have 5 senses at the beginning of this chapter, you were definitely forgetting this particular grouping. So let's consider, first of all, the vestibular sense. Maybe you've heard the word vestibule of a house. Anyway, vestibular sense. This is our sense of balance, or if you want to be fancy, our sense of equilibrium. You might remember when we looked at the ear, we didn't do the semicircular canals. We skipped this on purpose because the semicircular canals have nothing to do with audition, but have everything to do with the vestibular sense. They work rather like the cochlea. Just as the cochlea has fluid, the semicircular canals have fluid. Just as the cochlea has hair cells, the semicircular canals have a slightly modified type of hair cells, and their working gives us our sense of balance. Now, if you've ever had maybe an ear infection and felt dizzy, that's because the infection of the cochlea is impinging also on the functioning of the semicircular canals. Or a different discomfort, if you have motion sickness, that is related to the functioning of your semicircular canals. I tell people with motion sickness that basically you have too good a set of equipment, too finely tuned. So if your semicircular canals are overly fine-tuned, you might get motion sickness. Now let's consider the sense of proprioception, which can include, depending on the speaker, the kinesthetic sense or not. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you'll see the forearms. There are receptor cells, neurons, in your muscles and in your joints and in your tendons. They give us a sense of muscle movement and also body awareness. Now, as I mentioned, some authors will include kinesthetic sense as part of proprioception. Other authors will list it separately, which is another reason why we can get many answers to the question of how many senses are there. Let's consider the kinesthetic sense separately. It is body movement without the positioning. Again, the neurons are in the same location, muscles, joints, and tendon. For example, maybe imagine trying to walk without knowing where your foot is, being able to feel your foot and your ankle and your toes and your leg at every moment. You don't have to look, you can just do this because you have a proprioception sense. People without this would not be able to do the simple feat of movement. Early in the course, I mentioned the very famous case study, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. In this book, there were many, many case studies by the author. One of them was about a woman who lost her proprioception and kinesthetic sense. The night before this illness occurred, she dreamt that she could not move or feel her body, and shortly thereafter, that unfortunate dream became reality. Initially, she could not even sit up in bed without tilting to the side. She could not feel her body, and she could not move any of the parts without directly looking at them. Physical therapy was long and intensive, and took her quite a long time to be able to walk. She originally had to look at every part of the body, every foot and ankle movement, leg and leg. She had to constantly look in order to be able to master this simple movement. People were very unkind to her, unfortunately. She was often yelled at, accused of being drunken or other things. Again, by the way, they have no idea what caused that particular illness. This was before we had techniques such as the MRI. So she could not feel her body, which would be proprioception. She could not move her body without looking at the parts, so she had extremely damaged kinesthetic sense. So these two do interact quite a bit, though your text correctly notes that the vestibular sense also interacts with these. For example, we'll constantly adjust our posture. That's related to our vestibular sense interacting with proprioception and kinesthetic. So we've discussed our senses and how they work. Let's consider perception. Perception is about the interpretation of the sensation, and the interpretation gives it meaning. Your brain has two different ways about setting out to do perception, bottom up and top down. In bottom up, you only have the raw stimulus. Whatever you're listening to, whatever you're tasting, whatever you're smelling, that single raw stimulus with no other information. We rarely use bottom-up processing. We use it in the laboratory with research. Maybe you'll be given a series of bottles to sniff and try to identify them, but real life rarely has bottom-up processing. We usually do top-down. Top-down has that same stimulus, but it has our cognitions. So for example, you might be smelling a particular odor, but you're in the kitchen near your garbage can. You might be smelling a different odor, but you're in the park by, say, the aviary where the birds are. So our cognitions include all our knowledge and awareness of the environment. If you can't understand a particular comment that a teacher writes, you not only have the comment, the raw stimulus, but you have the words around it, and you have the context, and you have your knowledge of the teacher. So most of the time we are doing top-down. But let's see if you understand this. We're going to momentarily go to the next slide, and I'm going to ask you to look at that slide very quickly, as quickly as you can, and determine what it says. So go to our next slide. Most students, when reading this quickly, see a bird in the hand. And if you didn't, this might be not the first time you've seen this, so try to remember back to the very first time you saw it. I remember definitely seeing a bird in the hand. Read it again. And sometimes even in the second read, people will still see a bird in the hand. Read it slowly. You'll see that it says a bird in the hand. Let's assume that you're the typical person, such as myself, who misread it. If you misread it as being a bird in the hand, were you doing bottom up or top down? So if you misread it. If you misread it, you weren't using the stimulus, you were using your knowledge of the saying. So if you were not using the stimulus alone, you were doing top down. So if you misread it, it was top-down processing. I find students often have trouble identifying the top-down versus bottom-up examples, so let's try it again in case you had difficulty. Read this phrase. You probably read it quite easily, but did you note that the B is the same character as 13? Let's say that you read them very easily. You had no trouble confusing the letter with a number. If you read it easily, were you doing bottom up or top down? Take a moment and decide. If you read it easily, you were doing top down. You know that typically sentences begin with a capital letter, and usually when we see a colon with a number in front of it, there's often a number or two in back of it in the case of time. So if you read it easily, you were doing top down. One last example. Most people easily read this as saying the cat. I'm sure you notice that the middle letters are the same. So in the first example, we were willing to accept that perceptually as an H. The second example, we're very willing to accept it as an A. So our ease is because we're using the letters surrounding it rather than just the stimulus. So another example of top down. So can you identify the stimulus? As a hint, it's a dog, presumably a Dalmatian. See if you can find it. If you can't, move on to the next diagram and hopefully you'll have better luck. If you needed help finding the Dalmatian dog, don't feel bad. Most students the first time around do need help. While we're at it, here's 3 interesting facts about Dalmatian dogs. They're often referred to as a coach dog because in the old days they would run beside the horse-drawn carriages, keeping the horses calm. They became the firehouse mascot because it was particularly important to keep the horses of the old-fashioned horse-drawn fire trucks calm. They'd be ripping through the city and all the more possible to get out of control. So we used coaches and particularly old-fashioned fire trucks. The father of the country, George Washington, was very, very fond of Dalmatians, and his Dalmatian was called Madame Moose. So remember, our topic is perception. Perception is when you interpret and make sense out of the image. So do you perceive this as being an old woman, a young woman, or can you see both? If you're having trouble seeing her, on the left side, the highlighted in white section is the young lady's face. On the right side, the highlighted in white is the old woman's face. If you need more help, if you look at the picture on the right, what appears to be a mouth on the old woman is a necklace on the neck of the young woman. On that same picture, what would be the tip of the nose on the old woman is the chin of the young woman. What on the old woman would be the eyes would be the ear of the young woman. That's all from the picture on the right. As you look at this figure, do you perceive it as a cartoonish man with a large nose playing a saxophone, or perhaps the silhouette of a pretty woman's face? Try to find both, and notice the use of the word perception because your brain is interpreting and organizing the stimuli. Let's continue with the topic of perception. What do you perceive this image to be? You should actually see it as 2 different animals, both a rabbit and maybe a seagull. If you're having trouble finding both, the beak of the bird would be the ears of the rabbit. Let's continue with our perception task. This is a variation of the old woman, young woman. In this one, the old woman's face is more distorted than the other one. So the tip of the old woman's chin would just be the neckline where it comes out of her dress of the younger woman. The necklace of the young woman would be the mouth of the old woman. The tip of the old woman's nose would be the chin of the young woman's face. The eye of the old woman would be the ear of the young woman. So let's continue with our perception test. You've probably seen this one before. The white center is either, you can call it a goblet, a glass, a chalice, a vase, and the black images should be 2 faces facing each other. This is a variation of the image we saw before. You should be able to see a rabbit and a duck, the duck perhaps looking at the clouds. So the ears of the rabbit would be the bill of the duck. Do you see 3 or 4 timbers? If you look from the perspective of the person saying 4, you will say 4. If you look from the perspective of the person saying 3, you will say 3. For our next task, please visit the following website. You'll see a statue, looks like wrought iron perhaps. Obviously from the website, it'll be a giraffe or an elephant, depending on how you see it. It'll be slowly turned back and forth, and this is actually a real statue. I think you'll find it very interesting. Please do visit the website. Chances are you've seen a picture like this, perhaps in a restaurant placemat. We know that A and B, based on our experiences, are the same length, though occasionally I have a student who insists on coming up and measuring it, and we all have fun with that. But most of us perceive, and remember our topic is perception, most of us perceive A is looking bigger This is because of the perspective of the shot. But not everybody in the world would say A looks bigger to them than B. This is based on our experience with two-dimensional images, books, pictures, paintings. If you take a person who had never seen a book, a picture, a painting, and ask them, do they look the same length or different, they would easily perceive them as looking the same length. So perception is influenced by our culture. Let's take another look of an image that is also influenced by our perception and our culture. You've probably seen a diagram like this in the past also, and know from experience that these three lines are the same length. But do you remember actually trying to measure it? I remember confusion when I looked at this way back in my intro psych textbook. Was not able to believe that the three lines were the same length. We perceive them as being different length based on our experience with printed two-dimensional media. A person who had never seen a book or a picture or painting would perceive all these three lines as being exactly the same length, which they are. How did you perceive them? Well, I always enjoy showing this particular slide in class. Students are always shocked that everybody doesn't see it with the images they see it. Why we see it in different colors has to do with unconscious assumptions that your brain is making. Some people spend much more time in outside natural light, others spend much more time under fluorescent light. Apparently the brain makes assumptions as to the conditions of the shot, and depending on where you spend most of your times, you'll see one color versus the other color. This is actually according to real research, by the way.